So far we talked about moderators, mediators, and in an advanced knowledge clip, mediated moderation and moderated mediation. But how do you connect your study to prior work using a mediator or a moderator frame? Suppose there's a relationship between two variables that you're interested in, and you want to contribute to this literature. These two variables could, for example, be innovation and firm performance. You look into the literature and what you find is one of two situations, perhaps. The relationship between X and Y varies between studies. Some studies find a positive effect, others find a negative effect. In other settings, you may find that the relationship is fairly stable across studies, but we don't really know what explains the relationship. We don't know there are multiple explanations for the relationship available. The first case lends itself well for a moderation setup, where you could say we have this relationship between the dependent and the independent, the other way around of course, between the X and the Y variable, between the independent and the dependent. But it is a bit, it's an unstable relationship. Now you could hypothesize on contextual variables, potential moderators, that may explain why in some cases the relationship turns out to be positive, in other cases it is perhaps an absent relationship, and in yet other studies you find a negative result. And this could be because an unobserved variable in previous research turns out to take on the value, doesn't really matter, 3 in some studies, the value 2 in others, and the value 1 in yet other settings. The relationship between innovation and performance may, for example, be different in young startup firms that are used to absorbing new innovations as compared to firms that are more mature. And if you sample in mature firms, you might find a different relationship than if you would sample in young startup firms. A research design could hence go like this. Previous research has studied the relationship between innovation and performance. Results, however, are mixed. Some studies find that, other studies find something else. I propose that the conflicting findings may be due to an unobserved or to a contextual variable that is as yet not included in the study. For example, the extent to which the organization is a mature organization. And that is then what you will hypothesize on. You have a main relationship between innovation and performance, and you introduce a moderation relationship to that literature. That is framing your contribution using a moderation frame. Alternatively, you could say, well, there's a relationship that is very stable across studies. We find that innovation leads to higher performance. But literature fails to understand or has not attended to the reasons why innovation leads to more performance. And your contribution could then be to introduce a candidate mediating variable that would explain why the innovative firms perform better or worse, depending on what the literature shows. You introduce the hypothesis and also allow for a path that is pretty much what the literature has been studying so far, the direct effect between innovation and performance. And depending on the relative contribution of these two paths to the explanation of firm performance, you may be able to say something about the share of the relationship, the part of the relationship that may be attributed to your candidate explanation. Your framing then goes like this. There is a stable finding in the literature relating innovation to performance. But literature does not really know what explains this relationship yet. Now I have a candidate variable that may explain why X is related to Y, why innovative firms are more or less performant. I'm going to develop a hypothesis that says that this candidate explanation, M, mediates the relationship between the X and the Y. And I'm going to study whether that is actually true, so whether these two relationships are significant, and also whether the part that I have introduced explains a decent share of this relationship as compared to the traditional part. So if my candidate variable M can explain, let's say, a quarter of the variation in the relationship between X and Y, then it is a significant contribution to the literature, because you have made clear what in 25% of cases is the mechanism that connects the innovation to performance. Now we've also talked about moderated mediation and mediated moderation. There, of course, more complex framings are possible. You could, for example, say that there's this study that shows that the mediator explains the relationship between X and Y. So prior research has figured out that, let's say, absorptive capacity explains why innovative firms are more performant. Now, your contribution may be to again add a moderation frame to this and say, well, what we do not yet know is under what conditions the innovation indeed leads to absorptive capacity, or the conditions under which absorptive capacity indeed leads to higher performance. Similarly, you could start from the relationship between X and Y and say that prior research has figured out an important contextual variable. Say, prior research figured out that the maturity of the organization is an important contextual variable that explains why innovation does or does not lead to higher firm performance. But what we do not yet know, you then argue, is what mechanism explains the effect of firm maturity on the relationship between innovation and performance. So your contribution could also be one of mediated moderation. It's important to bear in mind how your contribution relates to prior work. You cannot say, for example, there's this very stable finding from previous literature that innovation indeed leads to higher firm performance across all kinds of different contexts. And now I'm going to research whether that is context dependent. That can't go together. So a moderation frame requires some unclarity in the literature as to a relationship. Just like a mediation frame requires some stability in prior work, at least in a particular context. You can say, well, we figured out that in industry so-and-so this relationship is very stable. It may be totally unstable outside that industry, but you can then study what mediator is relevant, what mechanism is relevant in that industry in which the relationship is stable. So a mediation frame requires some stability in the literature as to a relationship, whereas a moderation frame requires some mixed findings.